Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming out for our sixth of the series on socialism in America. Tonight, we'll be discussing the 1960s, including the civil rights and student movements. I'll introduce your speakers in a moment. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. But first, a word about why we're here. We do political education so we can strengthen our work as activists. We look to the work of our predecessors, what was effective and what was less successful. We study theory so we can strengthen our analysis and better strategize and craft strong arguments for our case. And it's also a chance for us to get together with our fellows and consider what we can do to build a better world. So thank you for joining us. We have a great lineup tonight, but first, Isaac will share our community agreements. Isaac?
Absolutely. So our main community agreements are, everybody's here to learn, ourselves included. So just really good intentions and we're all here to learn. Progressive stack. So if you have a question in the room here, like in the physical room, you can raise your hand. And if you're in another world of virtual space, just type stack in the chat. We'll call on you, roughly on order, but we'll try and prioritize those who have not spoken yet or spoken less. And the way I like to say this is just drop your jewels, really try and be brief with questions or comments. Try and keep it to just really core points. We all I would love to go on and on right now about anecdotes. To tell an anecdote about that, but we're really trying to keep this to a minimum. Just really just get your point. That's it.
Great. Okay, so on with the show. So our tonight, we have a terrific lineup. We have Rachel Hines, Jeremy Cohen, Lee Ornati, and Donna Murch. I'll start with Rachel. Rachel Hines is the Central Brooklyn branch representative to the steering committee and a PhD candidate in art history at Columbia and a UAW 2710 member. Jeremy Cohen is a MEK resident, co-chair NYCBSA, PhD in sociology, professor at SVA, and thinks the left has infinitely much to learn from the civil rights movement. He also helped launch the Civil Quiet program, 5 years ago in New York City. Lee Ornati got involved in left politics with the anti-war and student movements of the 1960s, like SDS and the New Communist Movement. He worked for years in the printing industry and was part owner of Teddy's Bar in Williamsburg for decades. Donna Murch, who will be joining us around 8 via Zoom. Is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, where she is chapter president of the New Brunswick chapter of Rutgers AAUP, AFT. She's the author of the award-winning book, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, and is currently at work on Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. She has written for the Sunday Washington Post, Guardian, New Republic, Nation, Boston Review, Jacobin, and many others. Those are our wonderful speakers. The format for tonight is, I think we're going to have 3 different sections, and there'll be a Q&A following each section, and then at the very end, we'll have a general. So with that, I will hand it over to Rachel and Jeremy.
Carrington. Yeah, so should we kick this off?
Yeah.
Yeah. Should I? Okay, so Aaron, can we slide in there? Okay, so we are going to talk for a little bit about the civil rights movement and both the history of the civil rights movement as well as the influence of socialists on the civil rights movement, and socialists both in terms of people and in terms of sort of, as it were, socialist ideas, socialist politics. This is in Brooklyn, which I thought was cool, this photo, and it's an economic boycott, which we'll talk more about. Next slide. Some questions we hope to address. That should say what important elements are left out of the story of the civil rights movement that maybe socialists care about? What role did socialists play in the movement? What should our relationship be, NYCDSA, us socialists today, be to the legacy of the civil rights movement, and what are some lessons for us today from the time? Just thought I'd put a slide with some socialist leaders to start us off. Who can identify? Isaac, just one. well, let's spare the look.
Randolph on the top left.
Beautiful. A. Philip Randolph, labor leader. Rachel's gonna talk about him in a few minutes. Who else? Amber.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther King Jr., socialist. Good. Who else? These are maybe harder ones on the right. We got rid of the easy ones.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's Fannie Lou Hamer.
It is not Fannie Lou Hamer, though good guess. I think she was like on the edge of socialist politics, but never quite self-identified, so I didn't put her picture on. I thought about it though. Isaac, do you want to give us another one?
Bayard Rustin.
Bayard Rustin on the right there. Right bottom. And then right top. Ella Baker.
Nice.
So all socialists, all major leaders of the civil rights movement. I brought like a little, a couple books with me. One is A. Philip Randolph speeches for jobs and freedom. Another one is Martin Luther King, All Labor is Dignity, speeches he gave to labor unions and about labor unions. These, just to preview a little bit, are some elements of their legacy that get left out often in discussion about civil rights. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about historical origins, the prehistory of the civil rights movement, class strategy, economic vision, legacy. As quickly as we can go. There's so many cool things. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about the Jim Crow South really quickly, and then turn it over to Rachel to talk about the beginnings of the civil rights movement. So I think, the more I understand and analyze the Jim Crow South, I think in my mind, one of the best ways to think about it is as a fascist government. Complicated because a fascist government in a bourgeois democratic state, sort of like contained within a larger bourgeois democratic state. But here are some of the reasons I think we should think about it as fundamentally like a fascist regime. You have the subject population, i.e. Black Americans are subject to economic subjugation, total disenfranchisement, they don't have the vote. You have a one-party state, the Southern Democratic Party has no political opposition because of political disenfranchisement, so it rules kind of with an iron hand. You have racial codes separating out Black Americans. Famously, arguably, the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany were less hard or less awful, less repressive than the racial codes of the Jim Crow South, because in the Nuremberg laws, it was only if I believe your grandparents were Jewish that you were counted as a Jew and subject to restrictions, whereas in the Jim Crow South, they had what was called the one-drop rule. So if any Black ancestry could be found in you, you were subject to repression, terrible segregated housing, and fundamentally a maintenance of the regime through regular terror, lynchings, bombings, threats, etc. Now, I think what makes the civil rights movement so powerful and so important to talk about is most fascist governments, if we accept this appellation, fell through active intervention from the outside. We have very few incidences of internal social movements overthrowing a fascist regime. And so the civil rights movement, beyond its importance for American history, and we're here to talk about Socialists of America, is actually, I believe, world historically important insofar as you see largely through an internal movement of massive resistance by African Americans in the South, the overthrow of the fascist Jim Crow government. And so understanding how that happened, why it happened, what role socialists played is quite important. Is someone on the Zoom?
Sorry,
Thank you, Doug. Okay, next slide. I think I'm turning it to Rachel. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I mean, this is a political education session in the 60s, but I think as socialists and people who think critically with history, we should be wary of, periodizing too neatly, and, say the civil rights movement in the 60s, we should think about the conditions, historical conditions, material conditions that shape the terrain on which civil rights organizers operated. I think also, we should think about, what made it possible for that movement to take off. We ourselves have lived through a mass movement, the George Floyd uprising, Black Lives Matter movement, the largest uprisings in world history. But we know, having lived through it, that there were certain conditions in place that made that an uprising of that scale possible. I think one of them was a global pandemic that scooped people up, and then there was an outpouring of political energy. Another was the first Black Lives Matter movement, which preceded the George Floyd uprising by several years. So we have two phases of movements, and I think in the civil rights movement, we also see two phases of movements which operate and relate to each other differently. So what are the historical foundations for the civil rights movement? One is the modernization of the South. Another is the Great Migration of Black folks from not just the South to the North, but from southern rural areas to southern urban centers, from southern rural areas to Midwest and northern urban areas. So we see Black agricultural workers becoming an urban proletariat for the first time in this country. In this history, briefly, it's the Great Depression was devastating the southern agricultural economy, especially devastating the production of cotton. So large-scale cotton producers have overproduced. The price of cotton has dropped precipitously. This really hurts small-scale farmers, Black sharecroppers in particular. And there's New Deal government regulation that is aiming to raise cotton prices by strictly curtailing crop production. That too especially hurts Black southern rural workers. And so there is this of migration. Maybe you're familiar with, I'm an art historian, so I always think of Jake Lawrence's Great Migration series, a series of history paintings, American history paintings, documenting this massive move, which brings Black people into cities and brings a new type of worker to those cities. And so the first, I don't know if there's a slide for this. Is there a slide? The first kind of wave, I think, of the civil rights movement is not in the 60s, but is really in the 40s and 50s, and has different tactics, different strategies, and operates in different spaces on a different terrain than the civil rights movement we might think of with the 60s and mass demonstrations and nonviolent organizing. And the first wave of the civil rights movement really is in the realm of labor and wins victories in that realm. Black labor, organized Black labor as a path to political power, as a path towards making not just economic demands, but also political demands, especially in city government. One key player in this early wave of Black labor organizing is CPUSA, the Communist Party. So what we have here, this might sound familiar to partisans of the rank and file strategy. Communist Party organizers are getting jobs in industries and factories and workplaces that they see potential for organizing, and they're providing other kinds of support, material support, expertise, strategic advice, educational materials, printing, circulating demands, publishing them to Black workers. One center of the pen organizing is Detroit, where the Black UAW members become organized in the UAW and the automotive industry and win major key demands. They win hiring for Black workers in a highly discriminatory industry. They win promotion, especially within wartime USA, within war plants. They also, once the unions were organized, they mobilized to fight for housing. So they mobilized thousands of workers to defend a public housing project called which was the federally funded project that today is called the Circular Truth Homes. At the time, it's not called that, but white community groups were trying to prevent Black families from moving in. So unionized Black workers defend that housing. This is not just happening in the Midwest and the North. Organizing is also happening in the South. I think there's a myth that the South doesn't industrialize and the unions are from the North, but even in the South, for example, in North Carolina, a local 22 of the Food, Tobacco, Agricultural, and Allied Workers of America, FTA, wins its first contract in 1944, and then creates this network of Black shop stewards who become leaders in local fights against Jim Crow, fighting against police abuse, conducting voter registration drives. I think this is a really interesting connection because these paths later diverge. These unions These Black-led unions are huge in bringing people into local NAACP chapters. So this is a moment where the NAACP has maybe not yet adopted its later more legal focused strategy and is more of a grassroots community organization. NAACP membership skyrockets in places where Black unions are strong and large. And as a whole, the power of Black unions encourages not just civil rights as a workplace issue, but civil rights as a city politics issue. One key figure whose name we should bear in mind when we think about this phase of the civil rights movement is Asa Philip Randolph. And his story, I think, is the finest example of the kind of political power that these Black unions are wielding in this time. So A. Philip Randolph is a socialist. He is connected with the Communist Party. He grows disillusioned with that party, as did many socialists in this period, because of the party's position on Stalin and Stalin's relationship with Germany. Yet he is active in promoting a Black socialist political worldview, especially in his publication known as The Messenger. He begins organizing with an entirely, at this point, unorganized group of Black workers, sleeping car porters. These are entirely men who are in what I would see as a form of kind of like racialized servitude on the Cohen sleeping cars. These are, train cars where largely white, entirely white passengers have kind of servants to carry their bags onto the train and to bring them their meals. It's extremely lowly paid work. These Black workers subsist largely on tips. And are subject to constant abuse from the white passengers. Asa Philip Randolph organizes and founds the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, so a Black union founded in 1925, and it's a decades-long fight. They are recognized for 12 years, but in 1937, they become the first Black independent union to force a multinational corporation, the Pullman Company, to negotiate a labor contract, and they were admitted to the AFL. And Asa Philip Randolph becomes the first Black union president in the AFL. And so this union, after this decades-long organizing drive, becomes quite large. It has 18,000 members at its height. And Asa Philip Randolph was able to wield this political power in the 1941 March on Washington. He has all these workers, all these Black workers are staying together. They're ready to march on and, if necessary, occupy Washington around the federal areas. And with this political power behind him, Asa Philip Randolph is able to call a meeting with Roosevelt, where he successfully demands the creation of the Fair Employment Practice Commission, which is really the first substantial federal commitment to civil rights since like the mid-1800s, since around the 1870s. So a huge advance. And what this does is ends discrimination in federal employment. And since then, federal employment has been an extremely important path to job security, to economic security for Black Americans. Black Americans are highly represented in federal jobs. This is an enormous economic victory. So this is, an early phase of the civil rights movement. What happens? We don't hear a whole lot about unions in what we might most commonly think of as the civil rights movement, the 1960s. I think one key historical event that's happening here is the Cold War, McCarthyism, and the Red Scare. It is kind of a rupture in the movement that some historians see as really severing, this is very important for us as socialists, a moment where the fight for racial justice and economic justice is severed. And this happens when conservatives use the communist issue sort of as a cudgel, as a wedge to attack labor leaders, many of whom are socialists, many of whom are affiliated with the Communist Party. And so they are able to, for example, in one of the provisions of Taft-Hartley, among many other things, is that labor leaders have to sign pledges and saying that they are not affiliated with any communist organization. Other unions really start pulling back from having this communist socialist left leadership, expelling these members, barring them from leadership. The NAACP responds to this threat coming from the federal government by also ousting Black socialists from its ranks. And so this upsurge in labor organizing which is communist-led socialist, is really curtailed by the enormous federal crackdown on communism, and the NAACP membership declines. We see maybe more moderate, middle class Black leadership filling these roles rather than a left sort of insurgent organized leadership. And so I think this really is a moment of transition. And it's not, I'm not saying that the civil rights movement was not good at its point. It was just different. Its character was different, and it was operating on a different terrain, one that was post this massive labor upsurge slightly, and post the Red Scare and the McCarthyism, had a different character to its socialist politics. I think we can really see the second wave. Maybe move this slide. The second wave, or the second phase of the civil rights movement really, I think, begins in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. And this is, it's a targeted mass action. It is organized through working class institutions. And this is, I think, a really important lesson for us as socialists. The Black church in particular plays a really large role in the bus boycott. So the situation in Montgomery is, we mostly hear about the buses being segregated, which is an affront and dignity. And we think of, Rosa Parks' case as being, she refused to tolerate that segregation. But another issue with the buses was that they simply were not stopping in Black neighborhoods. They either didn't have stops there, or they did have stops there and the buses refused to stop. And so, workers are like, I got to get to work, the bus didn't stop. So part of the demands of the bus boycott was not only that the buses be segregated, but that they adequately service Black workers and Black neighborhoods. So Rosa Parks was chosen as a catalyst in this fight. And it was a boycott that was initially only planned to last one day, but actually went on for over a year, went on for 381 days. And during that period, as the Montgomery Black workforce boycotted the city's public transportation, the city's bus system, they organized a thorough, complete, total alternative system of transportation to get those workers to their places of employment. So the city has lost a massive chunk of its revenue from Black users of public transit. They fought back, the city fought back. Black taxi drivers were penalized, were fined. Police officers started ticketing Black carpool drivers. Insurance was being denied to the carpool participants. City officials reawakened this ancient on the books legislation that prohibited interference with private business, or with business, alleging that by not using the buses, private business was being harmed in Montgomery. But after a year, the demands were won. And I think what's really key here is the way in which news of this fight circulated, and the way that people's livelihoods were able to be sustained by community organizing and by the carpool system that was created. They were asking people to make a significant sacrifice, but also making it possible for them to make that sacrifice. And so I think that's an important aspect of this. But yeah, in 1956, Browder versus Gale ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional, and struck down any laws requiring segregated seating on public buses. And I think this is a legal victory, but it was arrived at through a different strategy than the strategy the NAACP had been pursuing up to that point, which was by picking selected cases, selected individuals, and doing organizing mostly mass press, PR, and legal campaigns around them. So different paths to civil rights outcomes in play in the same time, in the same place. And I think, just to make a little note that brings this history home to us as an organization, I think it's interesting that in 1956, at a socialist conference in Philadelphia, Bayard Rustin, who Jeremy mentioned a while ago, who was a key figure organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also a gay man, so a gay Black comrade in the fight, gave a speech called The Meaning of Montgomery, in which he interpreted the boycott as a watershed event in Black history, and as an anti-colonial struggle specifically, which Jeremy has framed this as an anti-fascist struggle, and many interpreters frame the civil rights movement as an anti-colonial struggle. But I only mention this because at that conference, Michael Carrington was also there. Michael Carrington, of course, founder of the organization, which we are members of. And one final note is that out of Montgomery bus boycott, one key figure emerges as leader, who's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'll pass it over to Jeremy now.
Brilliant.
Hard act to follow. So already maybe we have some clues from Rachel's fantastic presentation. Like, what important elements can you already see are generally left out of the story of the civil rights movement? Maybe we can take like a little time to discuss before we keep moving to the next phase. Lies my teacher told me. Yeah.
Economics, poverty issue.
Yeah, the poverty issue, right? And we'll get to, you know, King's last actions were founding poor people's movements. So the fact that, you know, this was a movement made by working class people. It had like some middle class leaders, but largely like were the people who were going on mass marches, who were reorganizing a bus system. These were working class and poor people. Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rachel put it really well, like with the boycott of this wasn't spontaneous. Like there was a lot of organizing involved. The Montgomery Boys boycott, they had to run a mimeograph like all night long in order to, you know, make out all the flyers from it. And that time, you didn't press a button to physically churn all that. It required a ton amount of work to give everyone the message of buses. I want to add one, and like the roots of the roots, the organizing roots is really important. Like I think Rachel really highlighted how Black leadership was created, especially through the union struggle. I also added in the Garvey movement being like a really important organizing force. I think that's a element that's left out of the story a lot.
Any others that come to mind? I think that's all super great. Yeah.
I think it was interesting hearing about the alternatives that were set up when the boycott was happening. So it's not just about don't do this, but you know, they had to organize to make sure that people still got to work. And I think that's something that I didn't learn about much.
Sort of the equivalent of like a strike fund. And yeah, it's like, you know, again, the movement did that for a year. I mean, I often feel like the kind of the plotted way we learn about the civil rights movement, like really understates its achievements, like, and how much organizing went into it, because it's like, you know, imagine any of us trying to set up an alternative bus system for a city for a year. And, you know, I think like, you know, it's a little intimidating. And, you know, it makes you appreciate the like incredible organizers that were in the movement. And they're thinking also, I'll just say really quickly about the leverage, and I'll get to this in a second, the kind of class strategy of the movement, that the leverage a lot of African-American people in the South had was over as consumers in part, so boycotts played like a key role in the movement, and also that getting things like the bus company to ultimately, if you have this recalcitrant political elite, you know, if you have this basically fascist or colonialist political elite who are like, fuck no, we're not going to move at all. If you eventually put enough pressure on companies like the bus company, where the bus company are like, look, we are going to go out of business unless sheriff, mayor, whatever, you guys like let go of the segregation thing, like then, you know, they were leveraging power in the way that working people have access to power. And it was a key way, if you read like Bayard Rustin's like strategic papers around this period, like he was thinking very much in these socialist terms. What power do Black working class people have? How do we leverage it to make change on elites, to get elites to concede? I saw Carl, I think, and then Carrington, and then one last one.
Yeah, just briefly, I really like the link, you know, to labor organizing and, you know, class struggle. And I think that in general, that linkage is both its good aspects and problematic aspects all around. It's very complex story. I think my understanding is that a lot of the organizing in the South in the 60s, there was a very strong union participation from some unions, predominantly African American. So I think that we're taught this sanitized that it's civil rights movement, it's about equality, it doesn't have anything to do with class, and it's America overcoming its, you know, terrible scar of, you know, but I think that's, I really like the presentation thing that way.
Yeah, just what Rachel pointed out, how the civil rights movement didn't come out of nowhere, that there had been so much work in the 20s and 30s and 40s that informed the movement. And the same applies, of course, to us.
Yeah, partly why the Socialist America series exists. History, the continuum of history. picking up the legacy. I just saw one last one. I'm going to keep moving. Sorry about that.
I don't know what was left out, but it's so beautiful to realize that these folks were so young. You know, I mean, when I read about civil rights, they all seem so old now. You're like, wait, they're like not that old.
And it is interesting. I mean, Ethel Randolph and Beard Rustin were like a little bit of an older generation, and then King was, but King was so young. King was super, super young. Let's go, I think, 2 slides further.
Can I make just one point on those elements?
I'm going to keep moving us. I'm really sorry, just because I want to make sure our other speakers have enough time. Sorry about that. One more slide, actually. We've talked about this already. So I want to talk about 2 last things, just to build off what Rachel was saying about the civil rights movement as we know it in the 60s. So, you know, obviously one of the most iconic moments that we have is the March on Washington. And one of the most iconic things we don't know about the March on Washington, it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I really like this sign. So, you know, maybe a sign we might more expect. From that story, we demand equal rights now, but then on the other side, there's also civil rights plus full employment equals freedom, which I still believe, but again, is maybe part of what's left out. So the demand for jobs was at like the center of the March on Washington, again, very much left out. That was partly picking up on Ethel Randolph's vision from 1941 that Rachel discussed, and Beard Rustin, another socialist, as she mentioned, planned the March on Washington, did the turnout, did the whole organizing of it. Ethel Randolph spoke at the march. And, you know, it was originally put forward by an organization called the Negro American Labor Council. So why was jobs in the title broadly? First of all, maybe most proximately, is March on Washington was full of a lot of union workers. Busloads and busloads of union workers were part of the people who made up the crowds that we see the big aerial photos of when we think about the history. So that's very important, and making a demand that built that coalition between labor that Rachel pointed out, there was kind of a direction between the intention of the civil rights organizers continually, that's why King was giving all those labor speeches, was to keep building and rebuilding that coalition, and especially the UAW, in part because of Walter Reuther's communist roots, I think, had like a serious commitment to civil rights, both in terms of funding and in terms of bringing workers out. More substantially than just jobs being in the title to get union workers there. I think there's this broad view, to go back a few further sessions to a session that Isaac led a while back. You know, part of the failure of Reconstruction, I think in a lot of people's analysis and Du Bois's analysis, and then in this generation of civil rights movement leaders, was precisely in its failure to do any major economic restructuring to create an economic place for African Americans that wasn't at the very, very bottom of the social hierarchy. So the famous 40 acres and a mule, the proposal to redistribute land during Reconstruction did not occur. And so there was kind of the sense that like the creation of economic equality, economic dignity had not been accomplished, and it was yet to be accomplished. The civil rights movement was often talked about as a second Reconstruction, and subconsciously thought of by organizers that way. The purpose of the march was stated by organizers to highlight the economic subordination of Black people in the US, and to think about what it would take to create lives of dignity for African Americans, which includes freedom and the achievement of civil rights, but it also includes massive economic redistribution to create housing, jobs, better wages, equality between the countryside and the city, and many more things, which we'll see kind of play out in a minute. But so it's important, I think, you know, there's a complicated relationship I think socialists sometimes have to the legacy of the civil rights movement. There's a little bit of a thought that like, and in part this is because of where our other speakers will take us, like kind of the trajectory of the 60s, but there's a sort of feeling that, oh, civil rights movement, kind of lame and nice because it, you know, made nice nonviolence, bourgeoisie isn't mad about that. And like, then we get into the real radical stuff at the end of the decade. And in my view, I actually think we socialists should take a lot more credit or put ourselves squarely in the legacy of the civil rights movement and point out to, you know, normies when they say like, I love what Martin Luther King accomplished, I love what Rosa Parks accomplished, I love whatever, like that was a great moral movement. Say, yeah, it was a great moral movement. It was a socialist movement. Next slide. last slide. So out of the March on Washington, as you might have seen in one of the readings, there was a Socialist Party conference that happened right after that, another conference to mention where a lot of the movement leaders, as well as Norman Thomas, the former socialist presidential candidate for the US, as well as Michael Carrington, got together, and they were kind of thinking about like, okay, we see the writing on the wall that Jim Crow is kind of like on its last legs. We have some work to do. There was still the March on Selma. There was still like plenty of work to do to overcome Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But there's sort of this question of like, what comes next? What comes next for the movement? And the big question is, how do we address both, what is the situation? So, okay, you have the right to vote in the South, but if you can't, I think in the movie Selma, someone says, it's great if you can sit at a lunch counter, but if you can't afford a hamburger, what's the point of sitting at a lunch counter? And then in the North, there's this extreme, even though there isn't the kind of fascist regime of the Jim Crow South, there is extreme economic subordination of African Americans. So there's this kind of question about like, what's the agenda? What comes next? And sort of out of that came a program kind of dreamed up by A. Philip Randolph, King, and Bayard Rustin called the Freedom Budget. The Freedom Budget for All Americans. I'm sorry, this picture is not so great of the cover. The quality is not so great, but I have some things on there that it included. So it was a massive call for basically taxing the rich and doing massive government spending to achieve equality for African Americans. The fundamental idea being that the market would not produce that equality if you just, were not sort of like believers that, as Barack Obama would later say in his presidency, that all you need to do is remove discriminatory barriers and then equality achieved, or because it's based on hard work, blah, blah, blah. That actually, according to this agenda, massive government action would be needed. So some of the demands were the abolition of poverty, guaranteed full employment, fair prices for farmer, fair wages for workers, so raising the minimum wage, housing and healthcare for all, so achievement of Medicare for all and adequate housing, the establishment of progressive tax and fiscal policies that respected the needs of working families. The civil rights organizers at that time recognized that to achieve this would be actually harder in certain ways than toppling Jim Crow, which is a thing to think about. Like if you believe that, it's sort of like harder than fascism, like overthrowing fascism. But the idea was that the toppling of Jim Crow, while you had very entrenched political opposition, you actually did not have all that entrenched economic opposition. Whereas getting huge taxes on the rich to knock down the slums and rebuild our cities so everyone had adequate housing would require massive taxation, would meet the opposition not only of political elites, but also of the full-on weight of the bourgeoisie. Maybe liberals would peel off. Like you just have a harder road to fight, because getting capitalists to say moral things is very hard, and to not be like immoral fucks, hard. Getting them to give up any money, possibly even harder. Ultimately, the Freedom Budget did not. It had a good launch and was definitely part of the envisioning of the Poor People's Campaign, the Chicago phase of the movement, kind of the civil rights movement when it moved north. That said, it was obviously not achieved because most of the things on that list we do not have. And it was stymied by, among other things, inadequate funding and the ramping up of the Vietnam War, which Lee's going to talk much more about. Again, I think it's a very important moment for us socialists to reflect on, both because of the influence of socialists on framing these objectives of the movement, but also in a sense because it's unfinished business of the movement. Like when we say we stand for healthcare, we are very much like our lockstep in the tradition of Martin Luther King, who believed that the only way to achieve full racial equality was to achieve full economic equality, and believed in a race and class unified struggle against establishment politicians and bourgeoisie. Last slide, let me pass it on. I think we know this answer more or less. You can skip this. Oh, I thought I changed this. I made a timeline, but we don't need that now. Just last quick question, only time for a couple of responses, but what would it mean for socialists today to reclaim the legacy of the civil rights movement? I don't know if, Rachel, you want to say anything on that first? You have like pride in place.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I've thought about. I mean, to speak, frankly, from a position in NYCDSA, what I think about a lot is both the racial and class composition of organization, and how we could change that so we could build the movement that we need by working with and growing and developing working class institutions. I think that a really big challenge for us, however, is that we live in a deorganized culture generally. And so the types of institutions that made up the social fabric, the 40s, 50s, and 60s don't play that same role anymore, especially if you think of churches and unions. So it's do we need new working class institutions where we can meet people and grow the kind of networks that facilitated something like the working class organization in Montgomery bus boycott, or what could serve that role? So I think that's that. Also, I think as Jeremy was saying, we should be vocal about the socialist politics of the civil rights movement, because since it is such a huge part of now our nation's self-identity and national patrimony, heritage, we should make clear that socialists were there in this pivotal in their history.
Okay, we need to keep moving to get to all our speakers. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Lee, you're next up.
Suddenly here. Anyway, so we're going to get to my slideshow. That's the last one. Perfect. So my story is about the student movement, and it's something I lived through. Jeremy said you can come and tell your stories, and I'm going to tell a few stories, but they're to elucidate what happened. So I'm going to tell the general story with some separate stories in it. So let's just get started. Slide, please. Okay, so what is this period? The period of World War II, after the post-World War II period, was a period of US dominance and hegemony. It was a period of sustained relative growth and stability, what Trump is referring to when he talks about great again. When he talks about great again, he is referring back to an idea of what this period was, which is not true. And though some of the working class had real increase in standard of living, Black workers, rural people, women head of household, they didn't take part. This was the father knows best world cultural hegemony. Next slide. So how did they get there? What was the economics behind it? So I think it was two things. One is, as we studied when we were talking about the 30s, starting in 1928, the US had 11 waves of public spending. And these waves were to have immediate results, but they didn't. But they all came together at the end, and I'm going to walk through them. The Hoover Dam created Las Vegas. There was nothing, it was the middle of the desert. What do you need there? You need water and electricity. That's what they did. They made water for California and the West. The Tennessee Valley Authority built water and electric infrastructure for the entire South. The Work Progress Administration built tunnels and major developments. The Agricultural Adjustment Act reorganized American farming, so it was successful. Lend-Lease built hundreds of boats and other munitions for Europe in 1941. During the war, the government took over the factories and basically wound them up to create munitions and stuff for the war effort and got them organized. They had been disorganized. They had been all rebuilt. After the war, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, the Manhattan Project, the Federal Highways Act, and the space program. 11 waves of federal spending. These 11 waves all didn't work as they were doing, but by the end of the war, they all started to work together. So World War II, so what happened? After World War II, the US had not been devastated. No war here. Europe was decimated. The US took advantage of that. At the end of the war, half the goods in the world were produced in the US, and 1/3 of total global exports were American. 1944, the wages were 50% higher than 1939. The war created new technologies, industries, and skills. Afterwards, the Korean War was used to build up Japan. The gross national product between 1940 was at 200 billion, by 1960 was 500 billion. The US moved to consolidate control of oil, South America, and the Mideast, and develop markets around the world. Next slide. So the GI Bill was full of inequities. It was a great thing, but 1.2 million Black veterans did not benefit. The Southern Democrats took it, made sure that it was run by the states, and it was enforced in a prejudiced and unequal method. Blacks were left out of universities, totally in the South and largely in the North. Low-cost home loans were passed out unevenly in the New York and northern New Jersey suburb. Fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill were non-whites. Unemployment insurance was enforced unequally. By the end of the period, one economist said that there was no greater instrument for widening the already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. Next slide. So the baby boomers, I'm a baby boomer. The baby boomers are what made the 60s go. And what was that about? So we grew up in families where the parents' main frame of reference was the experience of World War II. These families were more comfortable than their parents, and associated it with World War II. They were patriotic for that reason. And that's across classes, and it's different for different, but it was pretty broad. The majority saw World War II as a period where people had worked together for noble goals, even though the results were quite uneven. So at the beginning of the 60s, so that all being said, Black students were the first to move. In the beginning of the 60s, there was a generational political change, or at least that was what was perceived. People were hopeful with the Kennedys. My dad was an Adlai Stevenson guy. I was Kennedy all the way. 11, so. But there was a quick group of events that smashed this. The Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, early involvement in Vietnam, and then assassinations, JFK, RFK, Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwimmer, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, all bad, all bad. So you saw their parents' generation out of touch. Majority of the youth were not political, but they didn't want to be their parents. This spurred the rise of, in the beginning, there was green shoots of change, folk music, the Beat Generation, rock and roll. And when young people looked at the US culture, there was really nothing there. The WPA left culture of the 30s had been canceled. It was totally like no good. US culture was patriotic and stilted. Post-Hollywood 10 movies were often ridiculous, heroic extravaganzas, you know, or silly musicals about old men in France. It was not something that meant anything for us. It was terrible. And Betty Friedan's book in 1963, The Feminine Mystique, challenged the concept of family-based women's role and had a huge impact. Young people set out to make their own code. Music, dress, art, lifestyle choices. These were going to be ours, different than our parents. Next slide. So the civil rights movement, for a lot of people, was happening somewhere else, but it was very stirring. You know, the Greensboro sit-ins, the civil rights movement, which we just talked about earlier, and Marxist analysis began to come forward. Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael criticized racial oppression as rooted in capitalism and class struggle. They often argued that racism perpetuated the differences within the working class in the interest of the ruling class. And this is a cover of a 1961 pamphlet by Tom Hayden for SDS on the revolution in Mississippi. Very small then, not many people read it, but it was the beginning of what was happening. Next slide. So what happened? Broadly speaking, this was not the main trend. The main trend was the new working class, the new left. This was different than the old left. Just like people in general weren't going to be like their parents, the left was not going to be like their parents. And the free speech movement in California took a lot of attention. In 1962, the Students for a Democratic Society had the Port Huron statement. And they said, the new left must include liberals and socialists, the former for their relevance and their latter for a sense of thoroughgoing reforms in the system. Thoroughly off the mark, weren't they? Next slide. So this is a personal reflection, and that's my stories now. So the draft was a big force in radicalizing leftists. I personally, the summer before I went to NYU, I had to register, and they had something called student deferments then. I didn't believe in that. Students deferments, that wasn't fair. So I didn't go for one. I applied for a conscientious objector. Denied. So then I appealed, denied again, scheduled for a physical. Now a physical means you go down, they examine you, and then they tell you, oh, report 1 week later. This was not a joke. You were going to Vietnam. So again, I was turned down. I was assigned 1A, which means, and scheduled for another physical. I went there with a letter from a psychiatrist saying I was crazy. They said, okay, we'll look at this 6 months. A new letter, this time 3 months. Okay, so I began to leaflet at every time there was a physical at Whitehall. This was 39 Whitehall Street down in Lower Manhattan. There were demonstrations. So every 2 weeks there were big demonstrations. This is one of them. So I would leaflet, then I would go in, I would leaflet inside, get arrested. Then they made it 3 months, send me a new physical. Leaflet again, arrested again. Finally, they were about to draft me. So I applied for the 1S, the student deferment. I didn't want to go to Vietnam. They turned me down. They said, you're not a student, you've been here 4 times. You leaflet every time. Leave you. So I appealed, arrested again. So they were about to draft me. In January, there was an appointment that I had to go to. I had no way out. My lawyer told me, you have to go. You have to decide. And you had to decide, are you going to go in? Are you going to go to, are you going to go in and go to Vietnam and kill people? Is that what you're going to do? So I had decided to go in and organize. December 1st, right before my appointment, the lottery came in and I numbered out. I didn't have to go to Vietnam. But this was an important factor in radicalizing people. You really had to decide, are you going to go kill people? Are you going to organize inside? Are you going to run away to Canada? Very, very important. December 72, the last the last men were conscripted, draft ended June 73. Next slide. So the SDS, most students in most SDSers were not anti-imperialists or Marxists. They were against the system. They were anti-authority. They were even anti-authority within SDS. And there were hundreds of organizations on campuses around the country that were not SDS. And where I went in the Heights, our organization was the Heights New Left until the Columbia strike. And we became SDS too. So the Columbia Students' Uprising of '68 was sparked by a gym being built on city property in Morningside Heights. Now, I don't know if people know Morningside Heights, but there's a park. Harlem's down here. There's a park with a big hill. And then up here is Morningside Drive, which is at Columbia, right there. And the plan was that they were going to build this gym on the hill. And there was going to be an entrance on the base at the Harlem level, and that was going to be 12% of the gym for the Black community. And then there was going to be a totally different entrance with a different area, not connected, for the Columbia students, 88%. They called this Jim Crow. Okay, next slide. So the Columbia Uprising, the SDS was working on defense contracts. They were shocked to discover that Columbia was involved in war planning, and they had a loose alliance with the Student Afro-American Society. The two of them seized Hamilton Hall. And it was just a beginning thing. They didn't really think they were going to seize it. They decided to stay. And after one day, the Black students said, okay, we're taking Hamilton Hall. The rest of you go take other halls. So the white students took over 4 other buildings. So there were 5 buildings they occupied for a week. At the end, the city brought in cops, attacked, arrested 700, beat people, hundreds hurt. This led to an all-campus strike because the students were shocked that Columbia would do this. How could you do this in our lily white campuses? So after the Columbia strike, SDS grew to be the predominant left organization in the student movement. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1968 Democratic Convention here, because at this point, that was what was beginning to frame everything, was that we were going towards that. History is that the 1964 Democratic Convention, the Mississippi delegation was all white. And there was something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was organized by the civil rights movement. It had 108 delegates who they brought, and they said, we want to be seated instead of the Mississippi delegates. And they were Black, they were white, they were young, they were old, they were men, they were women, and they tried to get seated. And on national television, Fannie Lou Hamer, who had been a sharecropper, made the appeal on national TV. It was electrifying. One observer said, no human being confronted with the truth of her testimony could remain indifferent to it. Lyndon Johnson was watching it. He called a press conference at the exact same time so the television cameras would go to him and they wouldn't watch her speech. He did it on the spot. They tried to make a compromise, but in the end, none of these delegates were seated. And the Democratic National, the DNC, the same DNC we have today, hung in there and was insisted that they were what they were, which was segregationists to the end. You know, and the Democratic Party was a segregationist party originally. As we well know, Republicans were the integrationists. So anyway, so here comes the '68 Democratic Convention. And everybody's thinking, okay, this can be different this time. You know, things have changed. So what was happening right up to it? Martin Luther King had been shot 4 months before with riots in 100 cities. RFK was shot. He was running for president. He had won the California primary to be seated at the '68 convention. They shot him. There was a successful Tet offensive from the Vietnamese, and the US response was just massive bombing. Unbelievable, every day, carpet bombing, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. You know, people were in an uproar, and there was going to be a large demonstration. There was going to be the standard anti-war coalition, and then there's the Weathermen. I'm coming to the Weathermen next. But the Weathermen were there to start the revolution. They called it the Days of Rage, and they were going to bring the war home, they said. Meantime, Chicago Mayor Daley had ordered shoot to kill instructions for the police. Next slide. So this is going back to a little personal thing now here. So, so I had been in the SDS Heights version, but I was disillusioned. So I went to be part of a vocational ed. I wanted to be a shop teacher. So I went to a vocational ed program in Washington Square. And I started volunteering at the SDS regional office, which was at Prince Street, because they had printing presses. And one of the things I was doing in my vocational education was printing. That was part of what I wanted to do. And I was just sort of a young volunteer, help around, get coffee and stuff. But it quickly became clear that everybody hated the regional leadership and the local chapters were in full revolt. So who was this leadership? A lot of them were those people who led the Columbia strike, but they were the big leaders. They were charismatic. They were good looking. They were, you know, they were my idols. I was shocked, you know, I didn't like it, but I could see that it was true. I worked in the office. They were high-handed. They treated people badly, and they were plotting a change just for them. I came to see that they, well, so I argued with them and they said, okay, we're going to Woodstock. Why don't you come to Woodstock with us? And their idea was that this was home country, mother country radicals were going to be there. And they were going to whip them up and bring them to the Days of Rage. So I printed 2,000 leaflets, I put on my backpack, I hitchhiked up there 2 days early, and I started trying to organize. Now, this was not a message that went over well at Woodstock. And the Weathermen came up there and they tried to organize these people, and nobody, and they started screaming at them, yelling at them, arguing with them, fist fights, things like that. And they did that for about half a day and then they all left. And, you know, I came to quickly see that they overestimated the period. You know, they had the slogan, a single spark will start a prairie fire. That was the Chinese slogan. And in China, it was possible because the people had lived through overwhelming, grinding poverty for years and years. Wasn't the case in the US. Now, there was a lot of activity, amazing compared to before, amazing. But if you have, if you have to make an evaluation of what the period is and do your political work based on that evaluation. You know, you can't make left errors and you can't make right errors. Left errors by definition being you overestimate the period. to overestimate the people who you're organizing. That's what they did. So I became part of the opposition. We seized the office, we threw the weathermen out, we locked them out, and we started a print club. Well, we held the office for about 3 weeks because we thought they would try to come back, but they never did. They basically deserted the movement. They went off, they went underground, and the entire SDS organization was decapitated. So I joined a group of people there. It was a collective of 18 people. We formed a collective in those 2 or 3 weeks. And 6 people ran the print shop full time. 6 people worked. 6 people did organizing, mostly Panther 21 Defense. I'm gonna get to that. And 6 worked in the printing industry to raise money. And we did that for 18 months, 1 rotation of 6 months each. And we printed for the SDS chapters that were left, the women's movement, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, a lot of counterculture stuff. We printed for the gay movement, which was new. The Stonewall people came the next day after Stonewall. Am I going too long? Then the invasion of Cambodia changed everything. Next slide. Okay, so, you know, the Vietnam War was raging all this time and everybody was fighting it. So in November, there was a demonstration with 600,000 people in Washington, and we were part of a group of 10,000 who went to the Justice Department to talk about the Panthers, the war at home, as well as the war abroad. That was our slogan, war abroad, war at home. And it was amazing. Gas masks, fighting the cops, so much fun. And then April 28th, so leading up to this, Nixon had been elected, and he basically said, I'm going to end the war. I'm going to end the war, but I'm going to end it with honor. Okay. And soon thereafter, he attacked Cambodia. And people were shocked because it was a different country. I mean, the Sihanouk, who had been the head, had just been, the first thing he did was they had a coup, a CIA coup, knocked him out. And then the new guy that they put in said, come in and help us because the Viet Cong are here in our, and so they attacked. And everybody was shocked. Over 800 schools struck, more than 200 closed completely. You know, and it was the anti-war, the Ohio State killing of 4 students. Next slide. So it's a little repetitive here, but the schools were closed. There were millions of people striking. The National Guardsmen fired, killed 4 in Ohio, killed 2 and wounded 12 in Jackson State. And our little printing collective, which was on Prince Street in an office, heard that NYU was going to strike. So we all got up, we walked the 6 blocks over to Kimball Hall, which was the NYU print shop. It had been closed. We broke in, took it over, got the printing presses working, opened it up, and created a printing collective.
Oh, yeah.
Printing collective went for their 10 days of the strike. A lot of other things happened. They seized the Army math building and said they were going to blow it up, blow up a computer or something. A lot of things happened. But what we did was we created a collective where people could come in from the street. We would have meetings with them. We would talk to them about what they thought. Then we would get them to write propaganda, to make artwork. We taught them how to make the film in the darkroom. We taught them how to make the printing plates, how to load the paper in the press, how to run the press. They ran the press, and then we said, okay, go out and organize. We did this for 10 days. It was the greatest. We also used NYU postage and shipped literature all over. Next slide. These are two more of the, oh, just back there, that was the first thing, in the last one, sorry. So the Avenge poster was the first thing we printed, and it got sent around and became sort of iconic for the whole, right? And these are two more things that we did, both silk screening and printing. Next slide. So the Black Power struggle inspired up the student movement. There was the Black Panther Party, which was nationalist, socialist, and self-defense. There was the Revolutionary Action Movement, which was an armed group. There was the African Liberation Support Committee that did the African liberation demonstrations. There was the Nation of Islam. There was Amiri Baraka and Newark, who we worked with. But we were just trying to help. Next slide. But we love the Black Panther Party. Black Panther Party was the greatest. The story that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton sold copies of Mao's Red Book on the Berkeley campus to raise money to purchase weapons to arm the Black Panther Party. What a great story. We all got little red books and walked around with them. It was sort of campy at first, but then we read them. They were pretty cool. The Black Panthers 10-point program mirrored what we thought socialists should be doing. They had food programs, they had self-defense programs, they had education programs. If you read that program, it's an advanced socialist program. And the ruling, and they also went and visited the socialist countries, so we like that too. But
just because our next speaker is going to speak on the Panthers,
okay,
could we maybe?
All right, I'll just move it along then. It just went back. So the Panther 21 was what we did from then on. Okay, and we spent a year doing nothing but Panther defense stuff. And I'm going to cover this, but after them saying they had all the goods, they were going down, Panthers were acquitted in 20 minutes. Next slide. The women's movement developed from the beginning. There were some socialist, Marxist women's movement. Was more mainstream groups rose up too, doing things like the Miss America pageant. But slowly the women's movement brought the demands for equal pay, for domestic violence, smashing the glass ceiling, end to sexual harassment, sharing responsibility of roles at home, access to abortion on demand. These are all things that came out of that movement. The male chauvinism in the student political groups often was a little better than what was found in society at large, and many of the women found they could not thrive in existing groups and left to form their own groups. Initially, these often took the form of consciousness raising, but quickly moved to advocacy and action. Next slide. So, then the leftists didn't know what to do, the students, and they started having discussions and made a move to the factories, to be more Marxist-Leninist. Groups like the Revolutionary Union, the October League, the Communist Workers' Party, the Black Workers' Congress, the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. Altogether, probably 2,500 to 3,000 cadre dedicated their lives to joining the working class, communities, schools, and factories. I personally went to work in the post office, creating a group, a newspaper called The Outlaw, elected shop steward. I was made part of a group that led several wildcats. That's for a different class. Next slide. So this is one of the things we printed. We made stickers and posters and covered the subways through it. And this is the demonstration that Great.
And last but not least, not at all least, our guest speaker, Donna Murch.
Hey, everybody. I was going to try to share slides, but it doesn't seem to be activated. Is it possible to allow me to share?
Yeah, Donna, 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get you on screen. So, sorry, I think I need to make you a host.
And it's all right. I can do the talk about the slides, but I figured since everyone had slides, I should have slides too.
Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Here. Yeah. Slideshow. Can everyone hear me okay? I can't quite see. Can you hear me okay?
We were muted. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to set my timer, make sure I don't go over because I know that it's getting late. Give me 1 second. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and to participate in political education with DSA New York. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Panthers today. Most of the stuff I'll be presenting is from my first book, Living for the City, which was really a social history of the genesis of the party. Something I'd say about this is that I researched this in the 1990s and early 2000s in California. So I was living in Oakland, going to school at Berkeley. So I was, I was gonna say victim, but I experienced Berkeley in the 90s, which was not Berkeley in the 60s. It was John Woo authoring the California Civil Rights Initiative. It was really Berkeley as a time of reaction, it being really central to the continuation of the Bakke decision. And I think that Berkeley was an object lesson in the aftermath of social movements, that institutions can close themselves in order to prevent them from happening again. So the first thing I'd say is, in relation to the other presentations, is that historians and even more so journalists often talk about the Watts Rebellion of 1965 as this decisive moment in that transition from the golden era of civil rights, which was based on dismantling statutory segregation in the South, and the more complex and broader struggle in areas outside the South, which I think in today's terms, we would really talk about as racial capitalism. So what Bayard Rustin called housing, education, and jobs becomes the core terrain under really the Black Power movement. So there are different ways to understand Black Power. I think the older way was to use it as the antithesis of the civil rights movement. It was to view it as a form of reaction to the civil rights movement. But I think it makes more sense to see a greater continuity of the long Black freedom struggle, that you have these multiple forms of African-American modes and registers of politics that assumed different forms in different regions and cities across the country. But I do want to emphasize Watts and the urban rebellions that followed, really from about 1965 through the early 70s. We might extend it as far as the Liberty City rebellions in 1980. But these were mass uprisings that were protesting often the absence of Black business and I'd say Black spaces that they controlled themselves. So in the Watts Rebellion, you see a very clear pattern of violence directed at businesses that were owned by non-Black owners who lived outside the area of Watts. So it was a protest of what people at the time called internal colonization. So being angry at the disparity in material realities. And one thing I like to emphasize about this period is that in many ways, although the national narrative is to draw a line from the civil rights movement to the present, I actually think the fights and the northern urban rebellions outside the South are better placed to understand the kind of struggles that we have today, because at their core, they were racialized economic struggles. So it's in this context that the Black Panther Party emerges a year after the Watts Rebellion. One thing that's really important about the Panther Party is that this was a militant Black working class movement that was launched by the children of defense workers who had migrated to the Bay Area. Many of them come from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And it's a beautiful story. It's a story about people literally migrating to work in the defense industry because of the segregated shipyards in the South. They couldn't get these high-paying jobs. They migrate to the West Coast to get access to shipyard employment and also for their children to have access to better education. So it's a kind of story about unexpected outcomes, that it's actually a defense migration that would produce this radical Marxist movement out on the West Coast that was, attacked and was a source of terror for the anti-communist US government. This map is a map I created in my book, and it just shows the increase in the Black population. The thing that you need to know about the Panthers is that their organization is really a reflection of demographic transformation in Oakland. So you have a tiny Black population in 1940, it grows to 10% in 1950. By 1960, it's roughly a third. And by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, it's Black majority. So that's the first argument, is not to look at the Panthers simply as leaders, but that they're a reflection of these Black working class migrants coming out of the South. This image is a picture of Donald Worden. And Donald Worden was one of the founders of the Afro-American Association. This is also the study group that our vice president's parents were a part of. Kamala Harris, her father, who was studying economics at Stanford, both of them were actually members of it. It's formed in UC Berkeley in 1961. It's a direct response to the murder of Patrice Lumumba. And it was an argument that we needed to shift away from domestic politics to international politics in the Cold War. Donald Worden is, I guess, he's what the Panthers would later call pork chop nationalist. But his initial formation of the study group brought together all these people in the early 60s, who were, a lot of them are going to end up at major ideological conflict by the end of the decade. But Ron Dellums was on the edge of this group. You have Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. This is some of their earliest politicization, is actually in a cultural nationalist organization that they later repudiate. And then you have the other cultural nationalist figures like Ron Karenga, who forms the US organization in Los Angeles. So I think of it as a Borning group. One argument that I would make about the party, and it's the core argument of my book, is that in the context of Cold War California and Cold War United States, we had lots of federal money being sent to public universities. They were seen as an extension, literally, of the state and important for national defense. So the competition with Sputnik and the Soviet Union. So one of the core cultural contradictions, maybe not cultural, I'll say one of the core contradictions of this period is that Cold War politics led to lots of funding for public universities. And the Panthers are part of that. So it's talked about in terms of the democratization of higher education. So in the Jim Crow South, 2/3 of Black communities did not even have high schools. So part of what segregation was taking the tax dollars of Black workers and redistributing it to the white population. So educational denial is core to the Jim Crow South. So when people get to the West Coast, this access to higher education for their children is a big deal. And I think that this is the real genesis point of the party. It actually came out of public university and a community college, which is where most of Black migrants and their children were attending school. This is the famous 10-point program. It's drafted on the edge of the Merritt campus. It's Xeroxed in a poverty program. And it's an interesting blend of multiple ideas. So the Panthers were a youth movement, and that really matters. They were community college students when they started the party. And you've seen them pulling from multiple sources and creating this kind of assemblage. So they use the language of the Declaration of Independence. They have ideas of socialist ideals of full employment. And then you also see the influence of Malcolm X in the call for self-determination as the first plank in the party, and the idea of looking to the United Nations plebiscite. So they're looking outside the United States to a global context. And there's really a transformation over the history of the party. So they start out influenced by Malcolm X and call themselves the heirs of Malcolm X. People call them Black nationalists, but yeah, they're influenced by Malcolm X. But from the very beginning, I think there is this awareness, as you can see in point number 10, a kind of internationalist view. But they go through their own transformation from nationalist, internationalist to intercommunalist, which I'll be talking about. The party is in existence for a long time. And I want to emphasize that because the common narrative of the party is its rise and fall. But compared to many of the other 60s organizations, they are still publishing a national newspaper in 1980, which is when the newspaper ends. But I would divide the party into these 4 different periods. Armed struggle, which is the party is best known for. What's interesting about this is that it's really used as the definitive vision of the party, but it's actually in existence for a relatively short amount of time. So after armed struggle, you have survival pending revolution. This is where the freedom schools are established, and later the longest running institution of the party, the Huey P. Newton Intercommunal Institute. In the 70s, the Panthers go into electoral politics and run a mayoral campaign. They are able to register to vote, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people. And so they're an important prehistory to the election of the first Black mayor. I will say that the Panthers are an object lesson in the dangers of incorporation into electoral politics. I think of myself as a big tent leftist. So I'm not someone who only views things through the lens of reform or revolution. I think, and DSA, from my understanding, also has this complex engagement and learning how to make claims on the state and making those and having an electoral strategy while still maintaining independent left politics. And I think that that's true of the party. However, when they went the electoral route, they took a lot of resources away from other local chapters and brought both the resources and the people back to Oakland. And this really helped destroy the party because many people were involved in prisoner defense campaigns, and I think it really disillusioned a lot of the rank and file, who were the party's most important resource. This is an image of a police patrol. These were being done from about September 1966 through May 2nd, 1967, when this practice was outlawed of carrying loaded unconcealed weapons. So very quickly after the Panthers start their police patrols, the state overturns the statute that made it possible. California had liberal gun laws. You would never have seen this in New York City, for example. So this is about really the party's genesis. It expands to the rest of the country. And like the point that was made in the previous presentation about the New York party, it really assumed the composition and the nature of the local communities that it organized in. So I'm talking about the genesis of the party in Oakland, but the story and trajectory in New York is quite different. My own opinion about this, and I think pretty much most Panthers would agree with me, is that the worst repression occurred in the biggest cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So even though the Oakland story is a story about responding to repression, the most political prisoners and the most violence was launched in the biggest cities, often run by collaborations between the intelligence agencies like BOSS under the NYPD and federal law enforcement. So the repression against the Panthers is an important part of the story. I wanted to show this image because I think it's really important in understanding the party. The moment of the anti-colonial struggle that they emerge out of. So here you have a picture of the Bootlickers Gallery, which I really wanted to revive in our strike fight over the past few months, but we did not do that or need to do it. But this is an image of Roy Wilkins of the NAACP licking the boot of LBJ. And it says about the Statue of Liberty, her back faces to Harlem. So Panthers really, they hated LBJ, they hated Thurgood Marshall, And this was because of international anti-communist politics. I love this image. I think to me, this encapsulates a lot of the Panthers' ideology of them using a vision of anti-police, today we would say anti-carceral state, and merging that with anti-military. So if you can see, the Billy Club says napalm, and it's linking local police, National Guard, and Marines. So this form of politics, I think, is especially important today as we've seen the collapse of an anti-militarist, anti-war movement. And for them, you couldn't separate violence at home from violence abroad. And I'd say that's one of the biggest things that sets the Panthers apart from a lot of radical organizing today, was that they absolutely grew out of the migration out of the South and all the complexity of the Black freedom struggle, but wedded to that mass mobilization on campuses, fighting the war machine, essentially. And so I think reclaiming their fight against anti-communism is really important. It's also important for understanding post-Cold War politics. Here is another image from the Free Huey Newton movement. So a year after the party's founded, all of the male leadership are in prison. It's in '68 that you begin to see the larger numbers of women, but this gives you a sense of the multiracial nature of Panther mobilization. This is another image. This is Eldridge Cleaver speaking at Berkeley. So that's Sproul Hall. So that, I think the Panthers are inseparable from the student movement. They themselves were students. And that's often forgotten because the way that they're racialized. You know, when I was trying to write my dissertation in the 90s, the Panthers were understood as a gang and they were talked about as a gang. So, you know, it's strange to live long enough to see this utter transformation where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, 20 years after I started my dissertation, was funding a Panther movie by Stanley Nelson. That was unimaginable in the 90s. So a lot of the understanding and projection of the party had to do with this period that followed. So this image is from the San Diego office of the FBI. There was a real attempt to dismantle the party, of the state repression and federal law enforcement under J. Edgar Hoover, and after. The Panthers were by far the single biggest focus, 70 or 80% of the estimated focus on tearing apart the youth movement and student groups of the 1960s and 1970s was directed at the party. I want to stress this image because one of the ways that the Panthers were invalidated is that they were an all-Black organization, but they had lots and lots of mother country radicals, as our previous presenter talked about. And so this sexualization of multiracial politics as a way to invalidate it was a core strategy. And I think these deep racial tropes that are both gendered and raced are very important to how movements are attacked and torn apart. Something I wanted to stress is that the party, it drew on the infrastructure of migrants. And one of the most important was the Black church. So the party that was this very secular Marxist Leninist organization had most of its breakfast programs in churches. And I think that that says a lot about the Southern migrant community that they came from. One of the issues in trying to reconstruct some of this history is that the party was constantly being attacked by the police and federal law enforcement from all over the country. And so they were always on the run. So their offices are constantly changing. One of the biggest points of attack was the newspaper. So they start publishing a newspaper in 1967. And as I said, it's published through 1980. And I think by 1969, it's published weekly. And it has this incredible art by Emory Douglas, which I'll be showing you in a moment. I chose this image because I think the party is also important in the way they made claims on the state. So they started their own food giveaway programs, but these are not mutual aid as it's talked about today. It was very much part of a larger organizing strategy, which was to shame the state. It's to say, you know, we're young people, teenagers in our early 20s. And we know that people in our communities are starving, and so we're giving out food. And it used that kind of a chicken in every pot, a chicken in every bag form of maybe patronage. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but wedding this, the idea that the party would be providing the resources that the state couldn't. But unlike anarchist mutual aid, this had a goal to it. It was meant to shame the state. So I think that's one of the most important things the Panthers did. The schools were their longest running institutions. And even though it's counterintuitive, if you look at the scale of oppression against the party, so much of it escalates in '68 after they've repudiated armed revolution. And there was a real fear about the idea of this intergenerational movement that was sustaining itself and educating a younger group of people. So that piece is really important, because I think in an earlier generations of discussions about it, the Panthers were hated and despised. It's hard to even talk about how bad it was. It was very hard for me even to write a dissertation about the party in the 90s, because the Panthers were considered destructive and they were held responsible really for the collapse of the labor left coalition in the 1970s. There's a lot to be said about that, because while A. Philip Randolph looks great in the 20s and 30s, and Bayard Rustin the same, it's important to know that by the time you get to the 1970s, these are hardcore Cold War anti-communists who ally themselves with Israel. They support these awful business unions abroad, and they support George Meany at home of the AFL-CIO. So there is a real moving right of that left labor coalition. In the 90s, the Panthers were held responsible for breaking apart that possibility. But we can talk about that more in question and answer. Okay, just hit the 20-minute mark, so I'm gonna wrap up quickly. I wanted to just show this image because to me, it embodies a lot of the party, that it's important to know that these were migrants from the South, many of them from the rural South. So Huey Newton's family is coming from Monroe, Louisiana, Bobby Seale's coming from Port Arthur, Texas. A lot of the Panthers' politics is also about Southern migrants who have guns, who grow up hunting and fishing. And it's a beautiful story about migrants from the rural South who are identified by Daniel Patrick Moynihan as the ultimate in cultural deficiency, that they lead this amazing multiracial movement, taking the ideas of Marxism and looking especially to Asia to lead this vanguard movement. So what I love most about the party is that it was a true working class formation. And they also focus on the lumpen proletariat, which was very, at the time, unusual, because they were interested in the problem of precarity. In other words, what happens when people don't go through complete proletarianization and become a working class? I can say more about why that happened in the Bay Area. It has a lot to do with federal defense employment, where for a few years, people had these great jobs that paid a lot of money. But in '45, in the San Francisco Bay Area, almost all those shipyards shut down. So they reflect that history, but their ideas about, what was called the lumpen proletariat and really Black precarity was really crucial. And I still go back and revisit those ideas today. I just wrote a piece towards a Black working class history of the long 80s. And again, unemployment is one of the core things that distinguishes the Black working class post 60s. And so the Panthers are articulating this at the time in ways that really predicted the future. So this image on the left is an image from Emory Douglas, who I consider one of the most, if not the most important intellectual of the party. He was a visual artist. And they took an image on purpose that was racially neutral. And that's important to say. So the Panthers themselves are facing police repression. They're also seeing white, Asian, and brown radicals being beaten by the police. And so they wanted a non-racial imagery to delegitimize the police. This is a beautiful print from Emory Douglas in this quote. I don't have time to read it, but the idea that art is central to the struggle and that it's important to use popular and recognizable forms. The Panthers were very good and very innovative as young people with very few resources who largely got the word out by having these, I don't want to say theatrical, but they were able, through the decisions that they made, to capture the attention of the press and use that in order to build a movement while having very few resources. There are, of course, problems with this, but I think that the production of their own newspaper, the importance of the art and reporting from around the world was an incredible accomplishment. People don't talk about this enough. I think it's one of the biggest reasons we talk about the party so much, because it left a very large archive. They also published over 24 autobiographies of many different people. So I really do think of this as a political movement had this strong art and letters piece to it. Okay, this is basically where I'm gonna end my discussion of the party. So in the 1970s, they go into electoral politics. Bobby Seale runs for mayor. He's not elected, but he does force a runoff with the Republican mayor. And the core way this worked was young people in community colleges were their campaign workers. As they turn towards electoral politics, there's really a disillusionment of the membership. One of the most important things about the party is that Huey Newton, one of the major founder of the party, is in prison through much of its life. And so he gets out of prison in 1970, but he's completely separated from the party that he founded 4 years before. So there is a lot of internal violence inside the party that's really painful and difficult to talk about. And I think that one of the things that the role of repression played is that it was constantly, we had large numbers of people that infiltrated the party. Emory Douglas estimated that it was up to 700 or 800 people when the party was at its largest of 5,000. So much like the history of the Communist Party USA, the scale of state repression, infiltration really affected the party. And I think that leadership itself, this is a picture of Huey Newton in prison, that the experience of incarceration itself deeply wounded Huey Newton in ways that left him really damaged. So I guess I will stop there. Yeah, I'll stop there. I can say more in Q&A.
Donna, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks everybody, Jeremy, Rachel, thank you all for that. So we have time for maybe 2 questions. We're already running late, but if there are any questions from people here or even on the Zoom, feel free to raise your hand or put your name on stack. Steve.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was really intrigued to learn that the dots played a role, some kind of like material role in the rise of this very progressive radical movement. I wonder if you could talk more about why, if that legacy is still there. I keep hearing stuff about East Bay being a very radical part of the country. Like I know there were like strikes there in the 90s, even like there were shutdowns and stuff. So I wonder if you could talk more about the relationship between the dots in East Bay, Panthers, and anything else. Yeah, thank you.
Shut off. You're muted, Donna.
Sorry, should I respond to that question, or are we going to take others?
We can take one more question. Is there another question from the floor on the chat?
There's one. I think Rachel can write. There's one on staff.
Rachel, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering what you think, you began by mentioning sort of maybe misinterpretations or kind of ways in which legacy of the Panthers has been received. And I wonder what you think the implications of those kind of distortions of that legacy has meant for our understanding of that period and maybe the way we think about their organization, the way we organize today.
Can we take
a little trouble hearing? Is it possible to also write it in the chat? I couldn't hear everything.
Can you just restate like louder?
Okay, I'm gonna restate it louder. I'm just wondering, so you began by introducing this question of how the legacy of the Panthers has been maybe misinterpreted or misunderstood. What maybe like wrong lessons do you think the left has taken for that? Or what does that misinterpretation of the Panthers' work and legacy, what has that meant for the left today and maybe inheritors of that legacy?
Okay, and then we have one on the staff. We have someone on staff.
Yeah, it's just someone named iPhone. Person, if you would still like to speak, go ahead and please keep your question or comment short. Okay, they're not responding, so I think we could just answer the other two questions.
Okay. Does that work for you, Donna?
Sure. So in terms of the docs, you know, one of the complex things about the party is that to me, it is very much a product of the Bay Area. That's why I was making that point about the Genesis point. So it's reflecting the presence of the Communist Party, the history of the ILWU, which is really crucial. When they run for mayor, one of their big proponents is to have a tax placed on all of the trade that goes through the Port of Oakland in order to pay for social programs. So it anticipates like that idea of Bernie's with a financial tax, but that they were thinking in the 60s and 70s about Oakland's central role as a port, as a source of income for social programming and for the party itself. So I think that they reflect multiple things. It's the infrastructure of educational institutions in the Bay Area, especially public universities. So you have Merritt College, you have UC Berkeley, you have San Francisco State, which is a poor place. The Merritt Black Studies program, where the Panthers are students, predates actually San Francisco State, and it has the first Black president. So that network of public universities in California, but especially in the Bay Area, is crucial. A lot of the teachers of the Panthers were graduate students from Berkeley who were very much leftists and involved in the anti-war movement and radicals themselves. So, you know, the Panthers to me represented something that the Cold War state feared most. So it was a linking of an left-wing anti-militarist movement with Black migrants from the South. And so, you know, this coming together of these different tendencies. And when I think of the left culture of the Bay Area, the ILWU is absolutely central. So I think that it's the status of the Bay Area also as the point of disembarkation to the Vietnam War is also crucial. So it's the docks and it's this position also facing east, its proximity to Vietnam and to China. And one of the differences, I think, between the Oakland Party and the rest of the party is how much their vision is centered on Asia. And it's true of the whole party, but you know, one of the conflicts with the Black Panther Party in New York was over questions of using Swahili names, for example, which Oakland repudiated. So I think that that location as a port, both a port city, literally the docks, but also where it's located on the Pacific Ocean in proximity to Asia is crucial. In terms of the legacy of the party, I mean, the first thing I'll just say, I feel like I'm at DSA, so I have to say this. I'm really disturbed by people who call the party an ethno-nationalist party. I think that that's crazy and it's unfair. And you have to be able to talk about the differences between the Congress of African People or explicit Black nationalist organizations and the party. I mean, one of the most painful things about the party is that they end up in internal warfare, fighting with people that they identify as cultural nationalists. So there's no doubt that the FBI played a huge role in this, but they were very explicitly a Marxist-Leninist party. And if you can't tell the difference between the African Liberation Support Committee and the Panthers, you've got a problem. So I think that is an absolute misrepresentation of the party. It's interesting because generationally for me, the debate when I was trying to write about the party was that, are they criminals or not? This is really how the party was viewed. It was viewed through that lens of mass incarceration. And they were used even as this kind of symbol of Black criminality that destroyed the great liberal alliance left liberal alliance that might have happened had it not been for the thugs of the party. And so it's really changed, I think. I'm still amazed at how mainstream the party has become in the post-Cold War period. So that's the other piece that I would say is the party was thoroughly a Cold War phenomenon. It's something that you can't understand without the Cold War. And I think at the tail end, when I was trying to write about this in the 90s, this is just a few years after the so-called end of the Cold War. And so there's always a period of, when time passes, things become less threatening, and then they can go through this process of being rediscovered and then being made into national icons. The party aren't national icons yet, but I'm shocked at seeing how mainstream it's become. But the biggest thing I would say about the party is that I love them, and they have many faults, which I could talk about, but I love them because they were Black working class formation. They took the ideas of Marx and Lenin, they looked to the wars going on in the Pacific, and they created this new form of politics. And I love them for that. And I think it's so important to understand that. Now I'm writing a lot about labor. I'm spending most of my time in the wages of higher ed labor organizing. But to me, that's not a contradiction between studying the Panther and doing this, because what I loved about them was let's write a Black working class history, because it looks really different. And they called out people that were considered the great icons like Thurgood Marshall because he supported the Vietnam War. I'll end there.
Okay, many thanks again, all of our speakers. And now Doug will have some announcements.